The additional data that I'm looking for starts with capital expenditures and D&A related to property, plant, equipment. As a preview of coming attractions, I'm going to need this to forecast property, plant, equipment. I need to know what my future purchases are, and I'm going to need to know how much of that gets depreciated. So it's good to have a historical sort of context for that. So capital expenditures, as some of you might know, capital expenditures is always going to be presented on the cash flow statement under cash from investing. Now, the tricky part there is to recognize that, it has, historically, it might be called capital expenditures, or it might also be called payments for purchases or acquisitions of property, plant, and equipment. CapEx is, by definition, the fixed assets you buy that hit your property, plant, and equipment. So that might be the challenging part there. So we grab it. The company spent $13.3 billion in 2018, 12.4 in 2017, and then 12.7 in 2016. So somewhat consistent. Notice here I want this as a positive. So I'm going to switch the sign. The next thing I want is D&A related to property, plant, equipment. So one of the interesting things that we're going to have to reckon with, and this is the case for most companies, is when you go to the income statement and you find depreciation and amortization, as we did earlier, to add back to EBITDA, this isn't all related to property, plant, equipment. And if I want to sort of figure out what happens to property, plant, and equipment down the road, I'm going to have to sort of figure out, well, how much new purchases am I making? How much depreciation am I taking out? Well, this depreciation and amortization also includes depreciation and amortization that hits intangible assets, might hit other items. So I want to go in and I want to look around to see whether the company will actually disclose historical depreciation just for PP&E, and it does. Sometimes it doesn't, and then we have to estimate it, but in this case it does. And it says the following in its footnote on page 48 of the reader, or 45 of the actual document. Property, plant, equipment, depreciation on property, plant, equipment is recognized, by the way, on a straight line basis, and the depreciation and amortization expense on property, plant, equipment was 9.3, 8.2, and 8.3 over the last 3 years. Notice, by the way, it uses the term confusingly D and A. Those of you who went through our accounting crash course and those of you who went through first semester accounting might have remembered that your professor said, well, depreciation is related to fixed assets, whereas amortization is related to intangible assets. That is technically correct, although what ends up happening is that terminology gets commingled. As you see here, Apple just uses the term D&A confusingly to not just D for property, plant, equipment. So we're going to be consistent with that. We're going to say D&A related only to PP&E, and we're going to push that in here. 9.3 billion, 8.2, and 8.3, and I kind of highlighted that for you here. Of course, they don't give you as much detail because they just say 9.3, so we have to round this off the way they gave us the disclosures, and that's okay. 8.3, so 8.3, and don't say 8.3 the way they're saying it, because we're denominating in millions, not in billions. So you have to just be mindful of that, because that'll create mistakes for you. We want entered as a negative, because this will lower property, plant, equipment. This will increase property, plant, equipment. That's the reason why we have to switch the sign there. And then the additional data we want to locate dividends and repurchases. Now, there are actually two places you can usually find dividends and repurchases. You can go back to the cash flow statement, and you will actually find dividends and repurchases there. Here it is under financing activities. Here are repurchases historically, and here are the dividend purchases. Now, the other place you can go, and you may remember it from a couple of minutes ago where we talked about going to the statement of shareholders' equity, and you can see the dividends as it affects retained earnings and the repurchases as it affects retained earnings. There shouldn't be a big difference between the two line items, but there's always going to be maybe a tiny little bit of a difference because of accrual accounting, where this is accrual accounting, whereas what's going on in the cash flow statement is pure cash. So we made a decision. It's immaterial to use the statement of shareholders' equity, so that's what I'd like you to use just to be consistent. If on the job use the statement, the cash flow statement, nothing wrong with that either. Just I just want consistency. That's the most important thing. If you're going across the last 3 years, just be consistent. And so we're going to go back and get this for each year. Kind of working backwards here, but this gives us everything we need. And you can see actually in the last year, this is a nice point to kind of take a step back, and you notice that Apple is consistently issuing dividends, but their repurchases really ratcheted up in the last year. They are buying back a ton of shares, means their cash flows are really good. They're trying to figure out what to do with their money, and they've decided to give it back to shareholders. The last two items I'm looking for is, as I'm going to forecast commercial paper, the company's debt, and as I forecast the interest expense for that, and as I forecast the interest income the company generates on its massive cash balances, I need to know what rate to use. So let's look at the historical rate. Does Apple disclose the historical interest rate it charges on commercial paper? So I'm going to search for the term weighted average interest. And I misspelled it, so it will not show up. Weighted average interest. Once I spell it correctly, it takes me to footnote 5, the debt footnote, commercial paper. The weighted average interest rate of the company's commercial paper is 2.18 and 1.2 in the prior year. Notice, by the way, this is a very low interest rate. I think all of us would probably love to borrow at a 2% interest rate, and certainly at a 1% interest rate. This is a borrowing rate that is incredibly low, and it has to do with the massive amounts of cash on Apple's balance sheet, the fact that it has so much collateral, the fact that it has such a strong brand enables it to really borrow at very low rates against the cash that it has. And then if we look at weighted average interest, let's keep looking and see if we have interest income. And we do here. The weighted average interest rate, this is in its other income expense footnote where it shows you what the interest income is. It shows you that the weighted average interest rate earned by the company on its cash equivalents, and marketable securities is 2.16, 1.99, and 1.73. And I'll pause right there. You could take a look at this and notice something very interesting. And that is that Apple this year gets a return on its cash that's the same essentially as how much it has to pay to borrow. This should give you some clue as to why Apple chooses to borrow. And in the prior year, it was even more pronounced. Whereas it cost Apple 1% to borrow, Apple generated 2% on its cash. So that should hopefully move towards an answer about why a company that can kind of demand these kinds of borrowing terms, why a company like that might borrow. All right. So with that, we have all the historical data we need to get started.